Good morning. This is Dr. McDaniel. I'm a board certified obstetrician gynecologist in New York City, and I'm bringing to you all things health related for women. Thank you for joining me at the corner today. And let's see, the last presentation I spoke about breast lumps or masses that are the basis of breast lumps and masses that are hormonally induced or have their source just from natural hormonal changes, and then how to recognize that and how to address them to a small degree or initially on your own. And today I'm going to speak about what some of those hormonal lumps and clumps and masses can actually be. So if I'll refer you to the original video, but as a 10-second summary, basically, our hormones rise and fall if we're still menstruating, premenopausal. Hormones rise and fall. They rise mid-cycle when you produce an egg. They fall when the menstrual cycle occurs and that egg hasn't been fertilized. And when they rise, when the egg is produced, there's a high degree of hormonal stimulation on tissues that are hormonally responsive or secondary sex organs. One of those secondary sex organs is the breast. So the breast gets stimulated 1 to 2 weeks before the menstrual cycle, and then they'll have decreased stimulation with the menstrual cycle. Due to that stimulation, I think most women recognize that the breast will get more sensitive, more tender, larger, lumpier, and clumpier. And for some women, they'll actually notice a very specific, or what we call a discrete or well circumscribed mass on their breast. And that mass can sometimes be kind of just a generalized lumpy clumpiness. So most of the time when that occurs, it doesn't really warrant any worry or index of suspicion. But when it's a well circumscribed, very discrete, very specific mass or lump, that's usually when women come in because they're concerned that they found a breast lump, rightly so. Now that lump can either be tissue, solid, or it can be liquid, which is a cyst. So a tissue, a mass, solid, clump, or a firm, hard lump. Until proven otherwise, we call it a benign tumor because a tissue growth is called a tumor. Whether or not it's cancerous or non-cancerous, it's still a tumor. If it's filled with liquid, it's a pocket of liquid, it's not a ball of hard tissue, then we call it a cyst. Now, just on feeling a lump, you're not going to know if it's filled with liquid or if it's a tissue, a tumor. So you're not going to know if it's a tumor or if it's a cyst. And both tumors and cysts can be benign, non-cancerous, or they can be malignant, which is cancerous. You're only going to know, for the most part, like 90+% of the time, you're only going to know if it's solid tissue or if it's liquid when an evaluation with an ultrasound or a sonogram is done. But if it's tissue, we call that a fibroma or a fibroadenoma, or some people just call it an adenoma. It's all the same thing. And a fibroadenoma is the breast tissue that's the firm structural parts that kind of give you perky breasts that kind of hold the tissue together. So you have fat, glands, and fibrous tissue. And as the name indicates, it's due to the generalized surrounding supporting breast tissue that's fibrous in nature. And it's called a fibroadenoma because it's fibrous, and sometimes it'll have, or I guess I should say, the majority of the time, it will have some of the glandular breast tissue kind of streamed in throughout it, and it's responsive to the rising hormones. So it's fibrous and it's glandular, it's a fibro. Oma always means tumor, so OMA always means tumor in medical parlance. So it's a fibrous glandular tumor of the breast, and by definition, it always responds to the hormones. So it will rise mid-cycle, 1 to 2 weeks before the cycle, and it most commonly will shrink back down to a smaller size after the menstrual cycle. Most of the time, but not all of the time. So sometimes it'll rise out the blue, it's never been felt, pop up before the cycle, and then it'll just sit there, and it can sit there for days, weeks, months, or even years. Now, when you notice this fibroadenoma or fibroma, most often it will be tender because it's sensitive to the hormones, and it's kind of a sudden expansion of the tissue. And when you have a sudden expansion of the tissue, it's often tender or more noticeable. Because sometimes women will say, I just noticed, I don't really notice my breasts usually. And then suddenly I just notice, I'm aware of this lump. And that's because of the pressure from it. If you notice that the lump does not decrease, does not shrink, or sometimes it'll even completely go away after the menstrual cycle, if you notice that it's still there or it's still a larger size than you recall it being previously, then it should always be evaluated. And the evaluation is always going to be an exam so that the physician or sometimes physician assistant or the nurse practitioner can characterize or describe the mass, and that's just for moving forward. And then an ultrasound or a sonogram. The sonogram will determine if it looks like it's tissue or liquid, so it's a tumor if it's tissue. And then if it's tissue, the sonogram will often notice kind of characteristic features of it. So it'll have kind of a grayish appearance, it'll be well demarcated, and there won't be any increased or abnormal or worrisome amount of blood flow to it, because abnormal growth garners an abnormal blood supply. So it'll have kind of normal blood supply around it. It'll look like the rest of the normal tissue, except that it'll be concentrated in that ball or mass. And then they will usually follow with serial sonograms to confirm that's just sitting there or potentially shrinking, that's not getting larger, that's not changing its characteristic features. They'll usually monitor that breast mass for 1.5 to 2 years. I think technically it's supposed to be 2 years, but realistically it's often 1.5 years. So they'll have you come back every 6 months, usually for 3 sonos. And if it hasn't changed or if it's shrunk and the features are the same, then it's a fibroma, fibroadenoma, or an adenoma. And the departing or the graduating for you, the graduating statement will be, don't come back unless it's changed, because now they've already established that it's stable, nothing unusual is going on. So you don't need to follow up again unless you feel like something's changed, it's gotten larger, or maybe it's very painful. And then same story, you want to follow up with the doctor and then follow up with an ultrasound or a sonogram. Tomato, ultrasound, sonogram is the same thing. So let's see. I will do the second half of this, which is the liquid portion, on a different presentation. I'm trying to keep the presentation short and sweet. So I hope that's been helpful information on one of the reasons for having a normal or a hormonal breast lump that can potentially come and go. Thank you for joining me at the corner today. This is Dr. McDaniel. Please hit the like, subscribe, follow buttons on the Facebook, the YouTube, and then also check out the podcast. I'm on 7 different platforms for the podcast. All of them are audio, for podcasts, except Spotify now has the video version. And then I have now over 300 video presentations on all things health related for women. So check out the playlist on YouTube for specific topics and information on those topics. And have a great rest of your day. Thank you for joining me. Bye.